Scientists from all over the world who publish through peer review process agree that early Homo sapiens in Africa had dark skin. It's the old boring explanation that it's an adaptation due to the intense ultraviolet radiation near the equator. And hi, I'm a real person, not AI. And this video doesn't just cover the light skin in Europe, but the entire world, how it developed into Asia and the Americas, went back into Africa, the entire planet, getting right into the mainstream, most supported and coherent theory. The fascinating connections to things like farming and examples of how it expressed itself really uniquely all across the world. And I want to make sure you have a complete understanding here, so we'll get into all the nitty-gritty details as the video goes on, even the more alternative theories. But at the end, you'll have a complete understanding of how light skin emerged. While some non-human primates might have light skin under fur, the genus Homo, or humans, lost most of their body hair millions of years ago. Most agree it started at least with Homo erectus around 1.5 to 2 million years ago, and so their skin would be exposed to more sunlight than something covered completely in fur. Dark, melanin-rich skin protects against UV damage and prevents folate depletion, which is crucial for reproductive health. Pale skin, by contrast, only evolved later and independently in populations that migrated to regions with lower UV radiation, where the ability to produce vitamin D from limited sunlight became a selective advantage. But the most interesting and compelling aspect is the role farming played in this. Essentially, white people are the result of the tech of domesticated plants and farming, combined with living in places with less UV intensity. The transition from foraging to farming began in the Fertile Crescent, especially Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, which begins around 10,000 years ago. Early Neolithic peoples in this region domesticated wheat, barley, and legumes, which became staples of a grain-heavy diet. Compared to the diverse, animal-rich diets of hunter-gatherers, these cereals contained very little vitamin D. This dietary change, combined with the relatively lower UV radiation of Anatolia compared to tropical Africa, created the perfect storm. Humans in this area now relied more on vitamin D synthesis from sunlight, which is significantly more efficient if you have lighter skin. It's from this area, from these people, that the SLC24A5 light skin allele emerges in the ancient DNA record. Neolithic Anatolian farmers show a high frequency of this allele, which is rare or absent in early foragers. When these early farmers began migrating into Europe around 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, they brought this gene with them along with their agricultural practices. As they spread into the Balkans, then Central and Western Europe, their grain-based farming culture and genes intermingled with local hunter-gatherers. Over time, this gene underwent strong positive selection in Europe, where UV levels were even lower and vitamin D from diet even scarcer. This created a feedback loop. The more the population relied on grains, and they're moving into areas with even less sunlight, the more beneficial lighter skin became. Archaeogenetic studies show that before the arrival of Anatolian farmers, Mesolithic Europeans lacked both SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, the two key genes associated with light skin in modern Europeans. But by 5,000 years ago, after millennia of interaction and mixing, these genes had swept across Europe. We have examples like the Neolithic genomes from Hungary and Germany already showing rising frequencies of SLC24A5, even in populations still mixed with darker skin hunter-gatherers. By the Bronze Age of 3000 to 1500 BCE, the combination of low UV, grain farming, and limited access to vitamin D-rich foods had made it so that light skin alleles were now common across much of Europe, especially in the north. This process was not merely genetic drift, it was not just a random mutation. And sorry, I have to mention it was not albinism either, if you saw my whole video on that. Instead, it aligns closely with shifts in lifestyle, sedentary farming, less UV intensity, and decreased consumption of fish and game, all which reduced vitamin D intake and increased dependence on skin-based synthesis, which is more efficient when you have lower melanin content. A similar, though genetically distinct, process appears to have occurred in East Asia. Rice agriculture began in the Yangtze River Valley around 9,000 years ago, and millet farming began in the north, the Yellow River Valley, shortly after. These early East Asian farmers also transitioned to grain-dominated diets, which also were low in vitamin D, especially in inland regions away from the sea. They're not as supplemented by fish, so just like in Europe, this dietary shift set up a new evolutionary pressure. Those who could more efficiently produce vitamin D through their skin would be at an advantage. But East Asians do not have the same light skin genes as Europeans. Instead, they developed different variants, including those in OCA2 and MFSD12, which led to reduced melanin production via different mechanisms. The major light skin mutation in OCA2, which is RS1800414, first appears in East Asian ancient DNA from southern China about 7,500 years ago, and it's right in the same area of these early rice farming centers. This mutation spread northward and became common across East Asia by 3,500 years ago, mirroring the expansion of rice and millet agriculture and the growth of sedentary farming societies like those in ancient China and Korea. The selective pressure for lighter skin in East Asia was likely amplified by similar factors to those in Europe. Lower UV radiation at higher latitudes, the lack of vitamin D in cereal crops, as you're having way more people and living in more densely packed cities. Not small bands of hunter-gatherers who are more frequently eating meat. These populations are becoming more agrarian. Ancient East Asians, particularly in the north, would have experienced long, cold winters with little sun, making skin-based vitamin D synthesis crucial. Over time, individuals with mutations that led to lighter skin had a survival advantage and reproductive advantage, especially in childbearing years when vitamin D needs are the highest. By the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age in East Asia, the frequencies of these new pigmentation alleles had increased significantly, showing clear signs of positive selection. If it was random or had no advantage, you likely wouldn't see such a rapid increase. And this increase mirrors the same agricultural revolution-driven process seen in Europe, though importantly it's happening via different genes. Just more proof that it's convergent evolution, two different people groups but whose bodies are reacting to similar stimulus, both the lack of vitamin D and lack of UV. To further support this theory of it being farming combined with the UV issue, we can just also look at the several regions around the world with long histories of grain and cereal-based agriculture that did not evolve lighter skin. These cases demonstrate that farming alone was not enough to drive skin depigmentation. It required a specific combination of factors, especially low UV radiation and limited dietary sources of vitamin D. You have to have these two together. When these additional pressures weren't absent, even long-standing grain cultivation did not lead to significant lightening of the skin tone. One major example is in some areas of equatorial Africa, sub-Saharan regions including the Sahel, the Arabic word which just means coast, and some West African regions. For thousands of years, people in these areas have cultivated grains like sorghum, millet, and teff, but these populations remain among the darkest-skinned people in the world. The reason is straightforward. UV radiation in these regions remains extremely high year-round, so there is always a need to protect folate and prevent skin damage, and so there is an evolutionary pressure to preserve dark melanin-rich skin. Even with farming and more plant-based diets, they're still able to get enough vitamin D synthesis from sunlight. They aren't being deprived of sunlight at any time of year like someone in Scandinavia or Korea. South India and Sri Lanka also provide a compelling case because these regions have practiced agriculture for over 4,000 years, growing rice, millet, and pulses. But despite this, many populations in southern India maintain medium to dark brown skin. While some light-skin gene variants like SLC24A5 are present due to gene flow from Indo-Aryan or West Eurasian populations, natural selection did not favor widespread depigmentation. It's the same idea. Tropical and subtropical UV environments continue to exert selective pressure to retain pigmentation. There's so much sun that even when you block a lot of it out, you're still getting more than enough to produce enough vitamin D. We can go to Southeast Asia, with rice farming cultures in areas like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. They've had rice-based agricultural societies for millennia, yet they too retain medium to dark brown skin. And it all aligns perfectly with that point of vitamin D coming from fish sources. These people are consuming a lot of fish and seafood, which is an excellent source of dietary vitamin D, all working so that there's no selective pressure to lighten skin. Last example is in ancient Mesoamerica. Civilizations like the Maya and Aztec had intensive maize agriculture for thousands of years. Maize is low in vitamin D, and the traditional diet of these populations was heavily plant-based, tons of people living in the city as well, and yet again they have medium brown to dark skin. It's because of that tropical UV environment. Even with the same evolutionary pressure from a similar cereal diet, the availability of year-round, strong sunlight allowed for sufficient vitamin D synthesis even in darker skin, and the protective value of melanin was more useful. So to be clear, grain-based agriculture alone did not cause skin lightening. Depigmentation only seems to occur when farming diets are combined with low UV environments, seen in Europe and East Asia. And what trips up a lot of people though is that these lighter skinned people can also move into other regions, bringing the genes for lightening skin with them. I'll get to how this relates to the San people later in this video. A funny thing to think about is we're kind of past these evolutionary pressures. In today's world, the health risks linked to skin color and sunlight, like vitamin D deficiency or folate breakdown, are largely managed through modern lifestyles. People have access to vitamin supplements, fortified food, sunscreen, protective clothing, and other medical care. And so while it's true that darker-skinned individuals living in low UV environments, like in the UK, might have lower vitamin D levels, it's really easy to just avoid this. A simple multivitamin, or even just the variety of sources of food we have today, is just far different from our ancient ancestors. We really don't appreciate how rare it was to eat meat when you lived in some of the denser cities. They had big festivals where everybody would eat meat, but mostly you had to be at least somewhat well off to have meat on a regular schedule. I'm speaking very broadly, of course, but you get the point that that's just not true today. Even low-income people are usually eating meat at least once a day. And again, some foods are fortified or you can just get it through a multivitamin. And then lighter-skinned people can also thrive in high UV environments by using sunblock and other technology. It especially won't be a big problem early on in your life, like it might have been for our ancient ancestors. In pre-modern environments, these risks could be deadly or disabling, especially during childbearing years. I've seen pushback that folate and vitamin D doesn't seem like that serious of an issue to necessitate such a dramatic change in skin color. But without dietary supplements or modern medicine, vitamin D deficiency could cause rickets in children and pelvic deformities in women, increasing the risk of fatal childbirth. Folate deficiency, caused by excessive UV exposure in people with light skin, could lead to birth defects or infertility. In ancient times, even a small drop in fertility or survival would have made significant differences across generations. Again, this is happening over thousands of years. These small advantages add up, driving the evolution of skin pigmentation in different environments. And so let's go back to our timeline. We do have some really recent new studies which help flesh all this out, making it all clearer than ever before. Going back to around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, when modern humans began migrating out of Africa with their dark baseline pigmentation. Throughout the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, in Europe, dark skin remained the norm. This paper is just a few months old, published in February of 2025, and it shows that this large-scale ancient DNA study analyzed 348 prehistoric individuals ranging from 45,000 years old to 1,700 years old, and it found that for most of European prehistory, the majority of people had dark skin. We even get some percentages. They estimated that as recently as 8,000 years ago, around 63% of Europeans were dark-skinned, with only about 8% having pale skin, and the rest had intermediate tones. Some very recent Europeans had quite dark complexions by modern standards. Britain's famous Cheddar Man of around 10,000 years ago was of the first people to resettle northwest Europe after the Ice Age, and he likely had dark brown skin and blue eyes. So even in far northern Europe, where low sunlight does favor pale skin, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers retained their dark skin. This change, of course, did not just happen overnight, not even in a few hundred years. What's striking about this image is that some of these Ice Age Europeans did evolve lighter eye colors, like blue or green, long before most evolved light skin. The genetic evidence points to blue eyes arising around 10,000 to 14,000 years ago, yet those people were still brown-skinned. Not the darkest complexion you can think of, but definitely nowhere near the lightest skin you can think of either. In other words, light eyes became common thousands of years before light skin did. And they think that blue eyes arose from a single individual. This was just a random mutation. The lighter eye color has no known strong adaptive benefit, and so it's believed to have spread by chance or sexual selection, unlike skin color. Basically, there's no health benefit to it. It was just unique and people were attracted to it. During the late Mesolithic, around 14,000 years ago, we see the very first hints of lighter skin in Europe. A few individuals in what is now Sweden and France carried genetic variants for light skin around this time. These were exceptions though, isolated cases of lighter pigmentation, while most of their contemporaries remained dark. The sporadic appearance of light-skinned genes in the late Ice Age shows that the process of depigmentation had begun, but as evolution usually works, it was slow and patchy. Like I said, all the evidence points to the major turning point coming with the arrival of farming populations from the Near East. Around 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, so 6 to 5,000 BCE, agriculture spread into Europe from Anatolia, the modern region of Turkey leading into Syria and Iraq. These early farmers brought more than new crops. They carried gene variants that produced lighter skin, and they eventually intermingled with indigenous hunter-gatherers. That's where we get the SLC24A5, associated with significantly lighter skin pigmentation, and this allele was almost universal in the Anatolian farmers, and is still found at near 100% frequency in modern Europeans. Ancient DNA shows that Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers completely lack the SLC24A5 light skin allele, but it appears suddenly in Europe with Neolithic farmers. As farming communities expanded across Europe between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, so 7,000 to 3,000 BC, they slowly spread these light-skinned genes into the gene pool. Now, if the comment sections on these type of videos are any clue, people are just going to project a million different things onto this. I said lighter, not white, and so it would be inaccurate to picture them as looking like Scandinavian or Korean people. They had medium brown dark skin, lighter than the hunter-gatherers they encountered, but still darker than what most people think of when you say European or white people today. We can picture many Neolithic people as looking somewhat like present-day Middle Eastern or Southern Mediterranean populations, but for sure they are tipping the balance toward lighter shades over time, by introducing the crucial new gene variants that have this direct role. Another wave of migration during the Bronze Age, from around 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, so now we're as recent to 3 to 2,000 BC, this further altered European pigmentation. Pastoral nomads from the Eurasian steppe, often called the Yamnaya or other related cultures, they expanded into Europe, and they too carried light skin alleles, partly from having previously mixed with farmers, but there are some unique things here like the SLC45A2 and TYR genes that also reduce pigmentation. By the Bronze Age, genetic data shows a higher proportion of Europeans with lighter skin, but still about half of Bronze Age individuals had dark or intermediate skin tones. Remember, before about 92% of Europeans had dark or intermediate skin tones, but now it's about 50-50. One well-known example is Otzi the Iceman, a mummy from the Alps about 5,300 years old, and DNA analysis showed that he had noticeably darker skin. Quote, darker than modern Mediterranean Europeans, but lighter than modern sub-Saharan Africans, according to anthropologist Albert Zink. In fact, Otzi's complexion may represent the darkest skin tone recorded in a European person from this time. Despite living in what is now Italy, Otzi was not fair-skinned. His tone may be comparable to that of some North Africans or Southwest Asians, and this just stresses that even into the Copper and Bronze Ages, being dark-skinned European was not unusual. The Iron Age, around 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, so now we're all the way up to just 1,000 BC, to even as late as the time of Christ. Across these roughly 10 centuries is when light skin finally became predominant in Europe. By this time, the successive migrations and admixtures, hunter-gatherers, farmers, and steppe pastoralists had created populations with a rich variety of genetic ancestry, and importantly, most of the key pigmentation genes for fair skin were now widely distributed. A recent study of ancient DNA found that only around 3,000 years ago is when lighter skin tones became clearly dominant across much of Europe. In other words, if you walked around Iron Age Europe, this would look like what you think of when you're picturing modern Europeans. You're seeing mostly light-skinned people, much closer to the range we see today. Even if some pockets did retain darker complexions for a while, by far now lighter skin, if you want to say white people, was now by far the majority in Europe. And even today, you do see it aligning with the UV intensity, where those in the far north have a strong selection for pale skin. Even though it's true, a lot of the Scandinavians are able to tan better than some Irish or English groups, for example, but that's a whole separate tangent. The point is, their overall skin tone is because of these same processes, and so it took anywhere from 10,000 to at least 5,000 years to complete this transition from dark-skinned Europeans to the lighter complexions we think of today. A very stark contrast to their ancestors from 40,000 years ago. And we might as well pause to remind everyone that the critique with those that believe that we were always the colors we are today, mostly this does seem to be driven by white people that are not happy to learn that their ancestors were dark-skinned, but on the opposite side you have fringe theories about whites being albinos. I've debunked all this a few videos back. It's hilarious, the horseshoe effect here. Most people think both of these groups are silly, but those two modern racially obsessed groups both agree that evolutionary pressures would not be strong enough to cause skin color change. And since it takes so long to become dominant, that looks like evidence in their favor, But again, it just matches how evolution works. Even with an advantage, it will be slow to take over, but still selected for and eventually does become the norm. All lighter skin or white people on Earth do not evolve from some separate evolutionary line descending from their own branch of hominins in Europe or Asia, nor is white skin an unhealthy mutation, the result of Yakub or some exiled albino tribe. The mainstream argument pulls from way more data and is way more coherent. So now I want to look at the timeline of the East Asian development. People in East Asia, the ancestral populations of the Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, etc., they share an ancient lineage separate from Europeans. After humans left Africa, one branch migrated into Europe and also into West-South Asia, but another branch headed toward East Asia. The East Asian branch, which also gave rise to Native Americans, experienced its own depigmentation process. The genetic studies confirmed that lighter skin in East Asians arose through different genes than in Europeans. They didn't just inherit European light skin genes, this evolved independently. The main factor in lightening here is not SLC24A5, but a gene called MFSD12, which has a unique variant in East Asian and Native Americans that contributes to lighter skin. Researchers found this East Asian specific variant and showed it was under strong natural selection in East Asia after their ancestors split from Europeans, and was later carried with migrants into the Americas. This shows that after East Asian and European lineages separated around 40,000 years ago, the East Asian ancestors began adapting in their own ways to northern latitudes. There's also the specific mutation in OCA2. Scientists checked this mutation in ancient skeletons across China and Siberia. None of the late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, those older than 10,000 years, had the light-skin version. The first appearance of this OCA2 light skin allele was found in a 7,500-year-old skeleton from southern China, so around 5500 BC. That individual from the early Neolithic Langdao culture had this new mutation and marked the dawn of lighter skin in the region. From that point, the allele spread quickly, but still, that's relatively quickly, and so now around 3,500 years ago, only 1500 BC, we see it reaching about 25% frequency in coastal East Asia and was spreading northward. Today, this OCA2 variant is found in roughly 60% of East Asians, but what's really interesting is that this particular mutation never reached Native Americans. They had branched off before it arose, long before that 7,500-year-old skeleton, with some of the last migrations out of this area being from around 10,000 years ago. And this partially explains why many Native American groups have somewhat darker skin than East Asians on average. Of course, OCA2 is just one piece of the puzzle. East Asian skin color is influenced by multiple genes, some shared with other populations and others unique, like how they do not have the European SLC45A2 variant that powerfully depigments skin, but they have other alleles that result in light skin tone with a slightly different biochemical basis. There's even recent studies that show that East Asians can be as light-skinned as Europeans, but their type of pigmentation may offer more natural protection against UV damage. Medical researchers have noticed that fair-skinned East Asians and Native Americans have much lower rates of melanoma, a skin cancer, despite visually looking to be about the same color. This suggests that the combination, the recipe for this light skin evolution happened differently, and this could just be mere chance, as it's reacting to the same stimulus but via different routes. Nature found multiple solutions to lighter skin, but not all light skin is the same at the genetic level. The indigenous peoples of the Americas are descendants of that East Asian branch. When a small population migrated from Siberia into the Americas around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, they carried with them the genetic makeup, and of course the skin tone, of Northeast Asians of that time. These Ice Age Asians were likely medium brown in complexion, darker than most East Asians today, but lighter than tropical populations. That happened before the OCA2 mutation, and so we do not see the same depigmentation. And so most Native American groups ended up with skin tones that are somewhere between the original African level and the later East Asian and European levels. Many have what's described as copper brown and light brown skin. And in terms of objective measures, researchers in one study found that having Native American ancestry was associated with a significant reduction in skin melanin index. It means you have lighter skin compared to those with African ancestry, and this is on the order of 20 melanin units. This reflects ancient adaptation to northern latitudes and their Siberian, East Asian ancestors, but because certain mutations didn't happen, they never get as pale as East Asians or Europeans, even when living in similar latitudes. You might have guessed why by now. Even Arctic peoples like the Inuit did not evolve truly pale skin, likely because their traditional marine diet was rich in vitamin D. This matches up with everything else mentioned before. This rich seafood diet reduced the selective pressure to lose melanin, and they're definitely not predominantly eating grains. Across the Americas, skin color varied with latitude and lifestyle, but broadly it's not the same as what we see in Europe and Asia. It all tends to stay in a tan to brown range. And lastly, I want to just turn to South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, where there's a really interesting mix. Many North Indian and Pakistani populations today have a high frequency of the same European light skin allele, SLC24A5. And this is due to ancient gene flow from West Eurasian agriculturalists and those pastoralist groups. This has contributed to lighter complexions, especially in northern parts of the subcontinent, though South Asia's intense sunlight means there was also strong retention of melanin. The result is a spectrum from darker brown to a much lighter brown, even becoming what might be called white. The average frequency of SLC24A5 was around 50%, though it's not as uniformly spread as we see in Europe. South Asians also have their own genetic variants affecting pigmentation, like SLC45A2 and TYR, which all makes for a unique mix seen in many Indian skin colors. And so the lighter skin in South Asia emerged from a blend of indigenous adaptation and incoming Eurasian genes, this timing spreading out over the past 5 to 10,000 years. Many South Asians of today likely resemble what West Asians and Europeans looked like several thousand years ago, before the extreme lightening in far northern Europe fully took hold. And no, this account is not based in India. And then people who migrated into equatorial Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Australia tens of thousands of years ago mostly retained dark skin. Indigenous Australians left Africa around 50,000 years ago and remained in very high UV environments, tropical and subtropical latitudes, and they kept levels of skin pigmentation as dark or even darker than many African people. And we'll end this timeline going back to where it all began. Even in Africa itself, light-skinned genes have occasionally moved around. The most notable case is the Khoisan people of southern Africa. They traditionally have moderate brown skin, a bit lighter on average than equatorial Africans, and genetic analysis revealed that one of the Eurasian light-skin genes, SLC24A5, was introduced into East Africa around 3,000 years ago, likely by Middle Eastern or North African pastoralists. And then this was carried into southern Africa 2,000 years ago, and in Khoisan communities, this gene underwent strong positive selection, rapidly increasing in frequency over just a couple millennia. The reason for this selection could be the reduced ultraviolet exposure in southern Africa, and while they're not living in densely packed cities and eating a ton of grains, there was a shift in their diet. If you watched my complete breakdown video on the Khoisan people group, some originally lived along the coast and consumed a lot of seafood. But as groups moved inland and adopted more pastoral and terrestrial diets, it made it a bit harder to obtain vitamin D from food alone. Obviously, they did not become white people, but they are notably lighter due to direct admixture from lighter groups from Eurasia, and it having a bit of an advantage. Not as much as in China or Germany, but that's why they're not as light as these people either. A bit of admixture and a bit of advantage made them a bit lighter. Some Khoisan people have been found to carry the SLC24A5 gene, and objective measures put their skin at about 14% lighter than it would be without this gene. This only started around 2,000 years ago, and it's an excellent example of recent evolution, a new allele introduced via migration that conferred a benefit and was retained and spread quickly. And while it is a localized case, it still aligns with the vitamin D hypothesis, the correlation with UV intensity, and gene spread from the groups where this originally emerged. Again, you take all of the data points together and it's very coherent. And I should note that this is often overlooked when talking about out of Africa. Since it happened around this East Africa region, people might picture the modern skin tone of people in that region today. That the OOA group was about the same color as people in, say, Ethiopia, or maybe the San people. But now that we understand the genetics, and we've done this entire timeline, you can see that they were likely darker, and this lightening emerged in Eurasia and came back into Africa, especially down this North African, East African, and down into the San people. Which is why we see those genetic markers pop up right on the timeline, but not before. It doesn't pop up earlier in Africa or Europe, but the lightening of skin emerges in Anatolia and into this Middle East up into Central Asia regions. It's lightening alleles from these regions that directly impacted Africa. And one piece of nuance I want to make sure to leave here is that scientists have cataloged well over 100 genetic loci that influence skin, hair, and eye color. Skin color is a classic polygenic trait controlled by many genes, each adding a small effect. When anthropologists measure skin color objectively, they often use a device called a reflectometer to quantify skin reflectance or a melanin index. Higher melanin produces lower reflectance or darker skin, and a higher melanin index value. For perspective, the difference between a typical West African and a Northern European in this melanin index might be on the order of 30 to 40 units. In a study of indigenous Caribbean people with mixed ancestry, researchers found that the component of their ancestry from Native Americans/East Asians made their skin about 20 melanin units lighter on average than it would be with purely African ancestry. By comparison, a single European gene variant like SLC24A5 or 45A2 could change skin index by 5 to 8 units. These numbers provide a sense of scale. The evolution of light skin wasn't due to one gene alone, but the cumulative effect of many small genetic changes, even if there are some major ones that stand out and that we can track, and that it evolved differently in different areas, from Anatolia to East Asia. And finally, no discussion of skin color evolution would be complete without addressing the Neanderthal hypothesis. I've seen it a ton in comments on my own videos. A popular myth suggests that Europeans got their light skin from interbreeding with Neanderthals, the archaic humans who lived in Europe and Asia before Homo sapiens arrived. It sounds vaguely logical since Neanderthals had occupied Europe's high latitudes for hundreds of thousands of years. It's often assumed they must have evolved pale skin, and by mating with them, modern humans acquired those traits. But genetic evidence said that this had no effect, at least not in any significant way. It's true that modern Eurasians have 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA on average, which it always needs to be stressed means that of the 0.01% that makes everyone different, 1 to 2% of that difference comes from Neanderthals. And some of those Neanderthal gene snippets can affect skin and hair biology. Some Neanderthal variants influence keratin production, which could impact skin texture or hair thickness. But when scientists specifically look at the major genes known to produce light skin in modern Europeans and Asians, they find no indication that these came from Neanderthals. Just think of the timeline. Neanderthals were extinct for tens of thousands of years before lightening even happens in humans. At the core, this theory is assuming that white people have been white people for hundreds of thousands of years, at least around 40 to 30,000 years. The most recent ancient DNA studies from Europe explicitly tested this idea, and they confirmed that light skin alleles in modern Europeans evolved in their own lineage. They're not borrowed from Neanderthals. In previous studies, similarly show that while Neanderthals and modern humans did mix, the genes for pigmentation in Neanderthals were different. They even think Neanderthals likely had a range of skin tones themselves. Some were lighter, some were darker, but those specific Neanderthal pigment genes either didn't survive or did not have a big effect on modern populations. The biggest effects in Europeans come from SLC24A5 and 45A2, which happened long after modern humans left Africa, and long after Neanderthals were extinct. So while it is true that there could have been pale, even red-headed Neanderthals, it doesn't mean that Europeans get this from them. I think I've made all that about as clear as it can be. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.